So Cordae just dropped his sophomore album From a Bird's Eye View, and I did do a first reaction to this album. And if I was to put that up, I would actually be quite upset with it because originally I had a very negative and very vitriolic response to this album. I found the latter portion of the album to be very mediocre and poor, but when I was recording that and when I was kind of piecing the thoughts together to put this video out, I kind of figured is that there is more to this that I need to kind of dive into. And while first reactions are great, they do provide some great moments. It provides this kind of raw, emotive kind of take on an album that can be entertaining and can also really bring out the music person in me because I just love getting excited about music. I feel like with this album, it does need some warranted time to it. And now that I have given quite a few listens to it, while there is still some inherent problems, while there isn't a lot of problems, the problems that this album has are pretty major to me. I appreciate this album now and realize that this album is quite solid, but I don't know if I'm going to be returning it to it all that much, especially into the latter months, even into the springtime. But I will say this album is particularly solid, so I'll explain why. I believe that Cordae does do well mixing the braggadocio and reflecting and reminiscing upon his past life. And if we're looking at the concept of a bird's eye view, I kind of understand the concept a little bit now, while it may be a little simple and people have probably caught it already. It's basically Cordae revisiting his life, or even revisiting up to this point of him just looking back on his life, looking back on his relationships, looking back on his friendships from a much more elevated status, maybe in a financial stance, maybe in a rap industry kind of stance. Because as I said in my previous video, Cordae has garnered this incredible following, and people really want the best for Cordae. People want him to be the next generation, or to kind of pioneer the next generation of lyrical rap and kind of push the game forward and kind of be this little beacon of hope amongst a lot of things that are becoming stagnant in the rap game. And I've talked about that numerous times. So going into this album, I do appreciate the mix. Jean-Michel is probably one of my favorites. I appreciate the ominous and bleak tone, which does correlate well with the content, diving into personal matters, diving into where he is now. I really enjoy Super now, actually. Super I was originally kind of lukewarm on, but I think the production, which is also kind of more of this darker tone, which I do appreciate that this album does go a little bit darker. I really like the humble brags on it. I do actually really enjoy it, and the flow switches throughout the entire song are actually pretty decent. It keeps the song invigorating, it keeps the song interesting, it keeps it nice to follow. I've grown a lot on that track. Mama's Hood has a great hook on it. It's probably my favorite hook on the album, and it does allow this time for some very personal contemplation and very personal reminiscing on a friend that passed away. And it says in the song that he talks about, they used to ball together, and he was listening to the album saying he was better than the Lost Boy. And that's really cool to hear, like, these little tidbits and pieces of someone's life, and reminiscing about a very good friend. And it really brought me to a time where I was in high school and I was on the basketball team. If you want to know some personal details, I was absolutely terrible at basketball. I scored 6 points my entire career, and I was a bench warmer, to say the least. But our team wasn't doing well, and one of my buddies was one of the star players on the team. And I was on the floor with him for the last couple of minutes. The team was not doing well. We lost the game. But I was able to give an assist to him, and he scored from the three-point line. And I look back on that now as a fond memory because, unfortunately, a couple of days later, he passed away in a car accident. And that lyric brought me back to that time. Brought me back to that time where that little moment of just passing the ball and getting an assist and getting a high five, like, it brings back the positive memories I have of that moment, because a lot of that was a lot of darkness. There was a lot of grief in that moment. I remember, since I was from a very small high school, there was only 120 people in the high school. It was a couple of days of just no classes. It was just mourning over the loss. And it's that moment brought back those memories, but also brought back that very positive one. So I'm very I'm very tied to that track, I think. And going through the track list a little bit more, just to get back onto just kind of analyzing the album. Want for me is kind of looking on a relationship with this elevated status, and looking is realizing is just like I have everything, but you still want something from me, and it's just like I can't manage or meet your expectations. While it's a good track, it's not one of my favorites. And then we get into a couple of the tracks that get a little dicey, and I'm going to skip around a little bit. Today, while I have grown on it a decent bit, actually, I do enjoy the track. It brings up the first inherent problem of this album, and that's the kind of sequencing and the tonal shifts. Because tracks 1 to 5, while Super does have that moment of just kind of reflecting and braggadocio and all that kind of stuff, Today is just a straight up banger, and of course Gunna's on it, and I've already done a review on Gunna, but it really makes the tone of the album get a little foggy at this point. And while the song is okay, I think the song is good, but I think separated from the album, I think it's honestly better as a single, to be honest. And I'm not a really big fan of some parts of the instrumental. I believe it's like a flute that's in the instrumental and some of the verses, and the flute note gets held a little bit too long to the point where it gets very sour, and I notice it every time, and it doesn't do much for me, and it kind of throws me off, but it's a good track nonetheless. But then Shiloh's interlude goes nicely into Coach Carter. It's one of my favorite tracks also. It has an incredible hook. It's another great reminiscing track. I absolutely love this track. It's one of my favorites. And it kind of has this Lost Boy kind of energy where it brings this warmness and it brings this kind of somberness to the album. And it just brings this nice little heartwarming piece. And we do get a lot more personal content on there, and that's fantastic. And I love Coach Carter as a movie itself, so I do have another connection with that also. But we do get this really personal look into Cordae on Coach Carter, and that's one of my favorite tracks. And then we get to some more dicey stuff. Sinister is definitely the weakest single, and listening to it more and more, I have grown off of it more and more also. The instrumental is not incredible. The hook is not the greatest, and Lil Wayne brings a more by-the-numbers verse for me. And it doesn't really do much, again, with the tonal shift of the album. It just keeps going all over the place at this point. Because we did have today, Shiloh's interlude, Coach Carter, then back to Sinister, then we're going into Chronicles. And Chronicles, I absolutely hated at first. And the shaking like Tourette's line, everyone points it out. And I don't hate the track as much anymore. And I appreciate that the album gets a little bit brighter with this song, and it does have a little bit of a break from the kind of like the ominous kind of darker tones of this album. I do appreciate Chronicles, but it's more forgettable, and it sounds like a radio single. It sounds like something that's probably going to inevitably be the next single after Today, and it's just not doing much for me. Her is probably the best part, and Cordae and her do have some good vocal chemistry. Lil Durk is Lil Durk. I brought up in my my expectations for this album. I brought up that Durk has been doing decent for me. Whether that was Who Wants Smoke or some other tracks, I was listening to Laugh Now Cry Later as well. And Lil Durk has been growing on me, but this verse is just very phoned in. And we get the Champagne Glasses, which doesn't have Nas, which is really strange. And I believe we go to Westlake High, where Cordae talks about, I did a song with Nas. And whether he's talking about life as a dice game, or he's talking about this, if he's talking about Champagne Glasses, then that's a lyrical inconsistency, because he's not here anymore. But Champagne Glasses is a good track. Stevie Wonder's harmonica is great, laced throughout the track, and the instrumental is pretty nice. The biggest drawback for me is Freddie Gibbs. And I love Freddie Gibbs. Freddie Gibbs has been dropping incredible music. And I remember I was listening to You Only Live Twice, which I believe came out in 2017. I've been following him ever since. But I believe this is one of the weakest verses he's ever put out. He's mentioned constipation, I think, at least 3 times on this verse. And while he does get into some nice pockets in the latter portion of his verse, it doesn't do much and it becomes kind of background noise. And the beginning portion just doesn't start the verse off well. I'm still kind of sour on that. And Westlake High is a good closer while there is some bonus tracks or whatever. Westlake High is a good kind of closer, good kind of footnote to this album, and it reminisces about the late grandmother that was singing on the interludes on The Lost Boy. And it's a very, I guess, bittersweet or more of kind of like a darker note, which I do appreciate that this album kind of doesn't have an happy ending. And looking at in the bird's eye view, things are a lot more critical, things are a lot more cynical, and things are a lot more depressing. And it's kind of the thing, it's like money can't buy you happiness kind of vibes and all that kind of stuff. So I appreciate the album does end on a little bit of a darker note. And I'm interested to see where Cordae goes from this point, but we do have some bonus tracks. I'm going to talk about Gifted first because I do have a little bit to talk about Eminem, because I did mention it before that I do want to talk about Eminem. And I was originally going to wait until Eminem dropped an album, but I want to talk about this verse in particular. Gifted is all right. Gifted came out with, I believe, the Just Until EP came out. And it's a decent track. It's a nice melodic track. I think Chronicles could have been the bonus track and Gifted kind of could have brought up. Because I think Roddy and Cordae on that song do have this nice kind of camaraderie and chemistry, and I think it sounds a little bit better in the context of the album. Chronicles, while it sounds nice and it's a nice diversion, I think Gifted does fit more in the cohesive sound of this album. But let me get to Parables. So Parables, I didn't listen to the original track. So hearing this, Cordae sounds good. The instrumental sounds great. And Cordae's more back on the braggadocious stuff, and that's totally fine. I think this track really works for Cordae. I think I'm going to get into the negatives a little bit more, just kind of an overview. But Eminem's verse is pretty much, to me, word vomit. It doesn't strike a chord with me at all. And there's been topics that have been brought up numerous times. The stepdad thing, while it is a dark situation, and I understand that bringing that up is kind of maybe therapeutic or something like that. We have heard this so many times. I can even think of Music to Be Murdered By, where literally the song Stepdad just talks about this all the time. We need some new lyrical content. And honestly, if you're not going to bring any new lyrical content to the table, like, what are we doing at this point? And there's a great line at the end of the verse where I believe it's like, I'm proud of my kids like Obama, and I came out of my shell. Get it? It's like, I get puns and I get these kind of double entendres, all this stuff is really cool, but if it's not executed well, it sounds terrible. And not to mention, Eminem's vocal mixing is really odd. It gets high at one point, then it goes low, and then it goes kind of into the mid-range, and then it keeps on diving into these weird kind of extremes. It's just a really weird song. I'm glad it's a bonus, because if this was in like the main portion of the album, I don't know if it would work. And because even though the bonus track, it doesn't work. But to summarize, I think this album has a lot of great portions to it, especially when we look at tracks 1 to 8. And that's just a really good run. Even I Can Excuse Today and Want For Me is still decent, and Super has grown on me. And while tracks 9 to 14 do have some more weaker moments, there's still those moments there that are just enough to give it at least warranted listens. Like, whenever I'm going to listen to this album, I'm going to listen the whole way through, because there are bits and pieces of every single track, even the ones that are not the greatest, that do show a great amount of potential, show a great amount of promise, and are warranting a listen. The biggest problems that this album has is the cohesion and the tonal shifts. It does get a little jarring, especially when we get to the latter portion of the album. I believe the focus gets a little bit taken away, and this good middle ground that tracks 1 to 8 had is kind of lost, whether that's kind of Parables remix, whether that's Chronicles, whether that's going into even just up in the other tracks, Sinister as well. Just the tonal shifts get a little strange. And another weakness is the features. The features don't bring anything interesting to the table, or don't bring anything that honestly Cordae could do. Lil Wayne could have brought a great feature, but he didn't. Freddie Gibbs could have brought a really great feature, but he was kind of mid. Her was probably the best feature on this album, and honestly, if it was just Chronicles featuring her, that could have been a much better track and a much shorter and concise track, and that could have worked. Jid could have worked perfectly on this album. Amine could have worked nicely on this album. There are so many different artists that you could have collabed with where these combinations now they don't make sense, but if you were to bring another artist on, maybe they could, and they could make these tracks more fleshed out and they can make them better. But I'm still gonna say that this album is very solid. If I was to give it a score, which I usually don't, but I would probably give it like a 7, 7.5 out of 10. It does have some inherently great moments. Coach Carter, Jean-Michel, Super, Mama's Hood, and Westlake Highs, all these tracks are great. They're incredible tracks to me. I will go and revisit Coach Carter all the time and Mama's Hood and all this kind of stuff. There's a lot more good and bad. And while there is some bad that does have some inherent problems that I hope are fixed, I think the core of the album still is intact and the album is solid. So let me know what your thoughts are below on From a Bird's Eye View. Did you like it? Did you kind of feel lukewarm about it? Have you grown on it ever since? Let me know in the comments below. Like, comment, subscribe. I'm going to be trying to get to the Earl Sweatshirt review. I'm not sure if anything else is dropping this coming Friday, but I will for sure look at it. If there's any kind of major releases, I'll do some expectations. But I hope you all have a good night. There's a big snowstorm that's about to come through, so I have to get ready for that. So you all have a good night. Peace out. God bless.